Welcome to the second half of our two-party keynote presentation for this MAAWG. Today is my honor and privilege to introduce Dan Geer. Dan is the Chief Information Security Officer for In-Q-Tel, which, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a nonprofit venture capital organization funded by the U.S. government through the Central Intelligence Agency. Dan's role in computer security has been extensive, primarily starting off with his time at MIT, where he was part of Project Athena. For those of you who aren't familiar with Project Athena, it was a very large undertaking in the 1980s that produced such things as X Windows and Kerberos. Since then, he has started several security organizations. Probably the most recent brush with notoriety was a paper he wrote in 2003 regarding the market dominance of Microsoft called CyberInsecurity, the cost of monopoly. From what I've read, I believe that paper cost him his job. So since then, he has branched out. He, in addition to all the cybersecurity work, informed me earlier that he operates the largest horse farm in Rhode Island and does some custom vegetable and other plant growing for a number of high-end restaurants. So a true modern Renaissance man. Therefore, it's my pleasure and honor to introduce Dan Geer. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Good afternoon to you all. I appreciate the invitation to speak with you today. I'm going to speak relatively quickly, but because of the format, you can pester me shortly, and Brian. He mentioned the farming thing. There are three professions that beat you into humility: cybersecurity, weather forecasting, and farming, and I do two of them. So let me assure you that the recommendations which follow, and I'll be making public policy recommendations, are given to you in all humility. But let me also be clear that humility does not mean timidity. Rather, it means that when a strongly held belief of yours is proven wrong, that the humble person changes their mind and is willing to admit it. I expect that my proposals will result in considerable pushback, and changing my mind may well follow, though I'll say it again. And let me be clear about this. This speech is me speaking for myself. It's important I say that. Anyway, as if it needed saying, cybersecurity is now a riveting concern, a top issue in many venues more important than this one. That's not to insult today's organizers. Rather, it is to note that every speaker, every writer, every practitioner in the field of cybersecurity who has in the past wished that his or her topic, and us with it, were taken seriously, has gotten their wish. Cybersecurity is being taken seriously, which, as you well know, is not the same as being taken usefully, coherently, or lastingly. Whether we're talking about laws like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act or the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, or the non-lawmaking but perhaps even more significant actions that the executive is taking, we, that is to say we in kind of parentheses, and the cybersecurity issue have never been more in the forefront of policy. And if I may say so, you ain't seen nothing yet. I wish I could tell you that it is still possible for one person to hold the big picture firmly in their mind's eye, to track everything important going on in our field, to make as few, if any, sins of omission. It is not possible. That phase passed sometime in the last 5 or 6 years. I have certainly tried to keep up, but I would be less than candid if I were not to say that I know that I am not keeping up, not even keeping up with what is going on in my own country, much less all others. Not only has cybersecurity reached the highest levels of concern, the highest levels of attention, and so forth, it has spread into nearly every corner. If area is the product of height and width, then the footprint of cybersecurity has surpassed the grasp of any one of us. The rate of technological change is certainly a part of that. When younger people ask my advice on what they should do or study to make a career in cybersecurity, I can only advise specialization. Those of us who were in the game early and who have managed to retain an overarching generalist knowledge cannot be replaced very easily. Because while absorbing most new information most of the time may have been possible when we began practice, no person starting from scratch can do that now. Serial specialization is all that can be done in a practical way. Being really good at any one of the many topics presented here all but requires shutting out the demands of being good at all the others. Why does that matter? Well, speaking for myself, I'm not interested in the advantages or disadvantages of some bit of technology unless I can grasp how that technology works. Whenever I see marketing material that tells me all the good things that come from adopting this or that technology, I remember what George Santayana said. Skepticism is the chastity of the intellect, and it is shameful to give it up too soon or to the first comer. I suspect that a majority of you also share that skepticism. It's magic is not the answer a security person will ever accept. By and large, I can tell what something is good for once I know how it works. Tell me how it works, and then, but only then, tell me why you have chosen to use those particular mechanisms for the things you have chosen to use them for. Part of my feeling stems from a long-held and well-substantiated belief that all cybersecurity technology is dual use. Perhaps dual use is a truism for any and all tools from the scalpel to the hammer to the gas can. They can be used for good or for ill. But I know that dual use is inherent in cybersecurity tools. If your definition of tool is wide enough, I suggest that the cybersecurity tool set favors offense these days. Chris Inglis, recently retired NSA Deputy Director, remarked that if we were to score cyber the way we score soccer, the tally would be 462 to 456 20 minutes into the game, i.e. all offense. I will take his comment as confirming at the highest level not only the dual-use nature of cybersecurity, but also confirming that offense is where the innovations that only states can afford is going on. Nevertheless, this essay is an outgrowth from, an extension of, that increasing importance of cybersecurity, with the humility of which I spoke. I do not claim that I have the last word. What I do claim is that when we speak about cybersecurity policy, we are no longer engaging in some sort of parlor game. I claim that policy matters are now the most important matters, that once a topic area like cybersecurity becomes interlaced with nearly every aspect of life for nearly everybody, the outcome differential between good policies and bad policies broadens, and the ease of finding answers falls. As H.L. Mencken so trenchantly put it, for every complex problem, there is a solution that is clear, simple, and wrong. The four verities of government are these. Most important ideas are unappealing. Most appealing ideas are unimportant. Not every problem has a good solution. All solutions come with side effects. This quartet of verities certainly applies to the interplay between cybersecurity and the affairs of daily living. Over my lifetime, the public expectation of what government can and should do has spectacularly broadened from guaranteeing that you may engage in the pursuit of happiness to guaranteeing happiness in and of itself. The central dynamic internal to government is and always has been that the only way for either the executive or the legislature to control the many subunits of government is by way of how much money they can hand out. Guaranteeing happiness has the same dynamic, that the only tool government really has to achieve the outcome of everyone happy and everyone healthy or everyone safe at all times from things that go bump in the night is through the dispensing of money. This is true in foreign policy. One can reasonably argue that the United States' 2007 troop surge in Iraq did provide an improvement in safety. One can also argue that the work of those troops, some of whom gave what Abraham Lincoln called the last full measure of devotion, was materially aided by the much less publicized arrival of C-130s full of $100 bills with which to buy off potential combatants. Why should cybersecurity be any different? Suppose, however, that surveillance becomes too cheap to meter, that is to say, too cheap to limit through budgetary processes. Does that lessen the power of the legislature more or the power of the executive more? I think that ever cheaper surveillance substantially changes the balance of power in favor of the executive and away from the legislature. While President Obama was referring to something else when he said, "I've got a pen and I've got a phone," he was speaking to exactly this idea. Things that need no appropriations are outside the system of checks and balances. Is the ever wider deployment of sensors in the name of cybersecurity actually contributing to our safety? Or is it destroying our safety in order to save it? To be entirely clear by way of repetition, this essay is written by someone as his own opinion and not on behalf of anyone else. It is written without the supposed benefits of insider information. I hold no clearance, but am instead informed solely by way of open source intelligence. This path may be poised to grow easier if the chief benefit of having a clearance is to be able to see into the future a little further than those without one. Then it must follow that as the pace of change accelerates, the difference between how far you can see with a clearance versus how far you can see without one will shrink. There are, in other words, parallels between cybersecurity and the intelligence functions insofar as predicting the future has a strong role to play in preparing for your defenses for probable attacks. As Dave Eitel has repeatedly pointed out, the hardest part of crafting good attack tools is testing them before deployment. Knowing what your tool will find and how to cope with that is surely harder than finding an exploitable flaw in and of itself. This too may grow in importance if the rigor of testing causes attackers to use some portion of the internet at large as their test platform rather than whatever they can afford to set up in their own shop. If that is the case, then full-scale traffic logs become an indispensable intelligence tool insofar as when an attack appears to be de novo, those with full-scale logs may be in a position to answer the question, how long has this been going on? The company NetWitness, now part of EMC, is one player who comes to mind in this regard, and there are others. This idea of looking backward for evidence that you didn't previously know enough to look for does certainly have intelligence value, both for the nation state and for the enterprise. And there's a lot of traffic that we do not have a handle on. John Quarterman of Internet Perils makes a round number guess that 10% of Internet backbone traffic is unidentifiable as to protocol. Whether he is off by a factor of 2 in either direction doesn't matter. That is still a lot of traffic. Arbor Networks estimates that 2% of all identifiable backbone traffic is, to use their term, raw sewage. There are plenty of other estimates of this sort. To my way of thinking, all such estimates continue to remind us that the end-to-end design of the internet was not some failure of design intellect, but a brilliant avoidance of having to pick between the pitiful toy a completely safe internet would have to be versus an internet that was the ultimate tool of state control. In nothing else is it more apt to say that our choices today may well be freedom, security, convenience, choose 2. Let me now turn to some policy proposals on a suite of pressing current topics. None of these proposals are fully formed, but as you know, those who don't play the game don't get to make the rules. These proposals are not in priority order, though some are more at odds with current practice than others and might therefore be said to be more pressing. There are more where these came from, but this talk has a time limit and there's a meta-analysis at the end. The first, mandatory reporting. The United States Centers for Disease Control are respected the world around. When you really get down to it, 3 capabilities describe the CDC and why they are as effective as they are. Mandatory reporting of communicable diseases, stored data and the data analytics skill to distinguish a statistical anomaly from an outbreak, and away teams to take charge of, say, the appearance of Ebola in Dallas. Everything else is details. The most fundamental of these is the mandatory reporting of communicable diseases. At the same time, we have well-established rules about medical privacy. Those rules are helpful. When you check into the hospital, there's a licensure-enforced, accountability-based, need-to-know regime that governs the handling of your data. Most days, that is. But if you check in with bubonic plague or typhus or anthrax, you will have 0 privacy, as those are mandatory reporting of communicable disease conditions as variously mandated not just by the CDC, but by public health law in all 50 states. So let me ask you, would it make sense in a public health of the internet sort of way to have a mandatory reporting regime for cybersecurity failures? Do you favor having to report cyber penetrations of your firm or of your household to some branch of government or some non-government entity? Should you face criminal charges if you fail to make such a report? 48 states vigorously penalize failure to report sexual molestation of children. The U.S. Computer Fraud and Abuse Act defines a number of felonies related to computer penetrations, and the U.S. Code says it is a crime to fail to report a felony of which you have knowledge. Is cybersecurity event data the kind of data around which you want to enforce mandatory reporting? 46 states require mandatory reporting of one class of cyber failures in the form of their data breach laws. While the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report found, and the Index of Cybersecurity, a separate topic, confirmed 70 to 80% of data breaches are discovered by unrelated third parties, not by the victim, meaning that the victim might never know if those who do the discovering were to keep quiet. If you discover a cyber attack, do you have an ethical obligation to report it? Should the law mandate that you fulfill that obligation? My answer to this set of questions is to mirror the CDC. That is, for the force of law to require reporting of cybersecurity failures that are above some severity threshold that we have yet to negotiate. Below that threshold, I endorse the suggestion made in a piece a few weeks ago, Surviving on a Diet of Poisoned Fruit, by Richard Danzig, former Secretary of the Navy, where he made this policy proposal, and I quote, "Fund a data collection consortium that will illuminate the character and magnitude of cyber attacks against the U.S. private sector using the model of voluntary reporting of near-miss incidents in aviation. Use this enterprise as well to help develop common terminology and metrics about cybersecurity. While regulatory requirements for aviation accident reporting are firmly established through the National Transportation Safety Board, there are no requirements for reporting the vastly more numerous and often no less informative near misses. Efforts to establish such requirements inevitably generate resistance. Airlines would not welcome more regulation and fear the reputational and perhaps legal consequences of data visibility. Moreover, near accidents are intrinsically more ambiguous than accidents. An alternative path was forged in 2007 when MITRE, a government contractor near here, established an aviation safety information analysis and sharing system, receiving near-miss data and providing anonymized safety, benchmarking, and proposed improvement reports to a small number of initially participating airlines and the FAA. Today, that's the end of the quotation. Today, 44 airlines participate in that program voluntarily. The combination of a mandatory CDC model for above-threshold cyber events and a voluntary ASIAS model for below-threshold events is what I recommend. This leaves a great deal of thinking still to be done. Diseases are treated by professionals. Malware infections are treated by amateurs. Diseases spread within jurisdictions before they become global. Malware is global from the get-go. Diseases have predictable behaviors. Malware comes from sentient opponents, as Brian pointed out. Don't think this proposal is an easy one or one without side effects. Number 2, net neutrality. There's a considerable irony in the Federal Communications Commission classifying the Internet as an information service and not as a communication service, insofar as, while that may have been a gambit to relieve ISPs of telephone area regulation, the value of the Internet is evermore the bits it carries, not the carriage of those bits. The FCC decisions are both several and now old. The FCC classified cable as an information service in 2002, DSL 2005, broadband 2007, and broadband over power lines as an information service in 2008. A decision by the DC Circuit Court of Appeals on this very point appeared earlier this year but settled nothing. The question remains, is the Internet a telecommunications service or is it an information service? I have nothing new to say to you about those facts, the near facts, nor the lying distortions inherent in the debate regarding network neutrality so far and still to come. What I can say is that network neutrality is no panacea, nor is it anathema. People's tastes vary, and so do corporations. What I can say is that the various tastes need to be reflected in constrained choice, rather than the idea that the FCC or some other agency can assure happiness if and only if it, rather than the corporations or the individuals, does the choosing. So let me channel for Dr. Seuss if I ran the zoo. If I ran the zoo, I'd call up the ISPs and I would say this. Hello, Uncle Sam here. You can charge whatever you like based on the contents of what you are carrying, but you're responsible for that content if it is hurtful. Inspecting brings with it a responsibility for what you learn. Or you can enjoy common carrier protections at all times, but you can neither inspect nor act on the contents of what you are carrying and can only charge for carriage itself. Bits are bits. Choose wisely, no refunds or exchanges at this window. In other words, ISPs get the one or the other. They do not get both. The FCC gets some heartache, but also a natural experiment in whether those who choose common carrier status turn out differently than those who choose multi-tiered services with liability exposure. We already have a lot of precedent and law in this space. The United States Postal Service has a term of art, sealed against inspection, that is reserved for items on which the highest postage rates are charged. Is that worth stirring into the mix? As a side comment, I might add that it was in Dr. Seuss's book, If I Ran the Zoo, that the word nerd first appeared in English. Item 3, source code liability. Nat Howard said that security will always be exactly as bad as it can possibly be while allowing everything to still function. But with each passing day, that "and still function" clause requires a higher standard. As Ken Thompson told us in his Turing Award lecture, there is no technical escape. In strict mathematical terms, you neither trust a program nor a house unless you created it 100% yourself. But in reality, most of us will trust a house built by a suitably skilled professional. Usually we will trust it more than one we built ourselves, and even if we have never met the builder or he is long since dead. The reason for this trust is that shoddy building work has had that crucial "or else" clause for more than 3,700 years. If a builder builds a house for someone and does not construct it properly, and the house which he built falls in and kills its owner, then the builder shall be put to death. That's the Code of Hammurabi, 1750 BC. Today, the relevant legal concept is product liability, and the fundamental formula is, if you make money selling something, then you better do it well or you will be held responsible for the trouble it causes. For better or poorer, the only two products not covered by product liability today are religion and software. And software should escape not much longer. Poole, Henningkamp, and I have a straw man proposal for how software liability regulation might be structured. Clause 0, consult the criminal code to see if the damage caused was due to intent or willfulness. We are only trying to assign liability for the unintentional, whether that's sloppy coding, insufficient testing, cost-cutting, incomplete documentation, or just plain incompetence. Clause 0 moves any kind of intentionality out of scope. That's for your criminal code to deal with. Clause 1, if you deliver your software with complete and buildable source code and a license that allows disabling any functionality or code the licensee decides, your liability is limited to a refund. Clause 1 is how to avoid liability. Make it possible for your users to inspect and chop out any and all bits of your software that they do not trust or want to run. That includes a bill of materials, like library ABC comes from vendor XYZ, so that trust has some basis, paralleling why there are ingredient lists in processed foods. The word disabling was chosen quite carefully. You do not need to give permission to change or modify how the program works, only to disable the parts of it that the licensee does not want or trust. Liability is limited even if the licensee never actually looks at the source code. As long as he has received it, you as maker are off the hook. Free and open source software is obviously covered by this clause, which leaves its situation unchanged. Clause 2. In any other case, you are liable for whatever damage your software causes when it's used normally. If you do not want to accept the information sharing in Clause 1, you fall under Clause 2 and must live with normal product liability, just like manufacturers of cars, blenders, chainsaws, and hot coffee. How dire the consequences and what constitutes used normally is for your legislature and your courts to decide. Here is an example. A salesperson from one of your longtime vendors comes in, delivers new product documentation on a USB key. You plug the USB key into your computer and copy the files. This is used normally, and it should never cause your computer to become part of a botnet, transmit your credit card number to Albonia, or copy all your design documents to the vendor. If it does, the operating system is defective. The majority of today's commercial software would fall under Clause 2, and software houses need a reasonable chance to clean up their act or to move under Clause 1, so a sunrise period is required. We suggest no more than 5 years. And that's it, really. Either software houses deliver quality and back it up with liability, or they will have to let their users protect themselves. The current situation, users cannot see whether they need to protect themselves and have no recourse to being unprotected, cannot go on. We prefer self-protection and fast recovery, but others' mileage may differ. Would it work? In the long run, absolutely yes. In the short run, it's pretty sure that there'll be nasty surprises. The free and open source software community will, in parallel, have to be clear about the level of care they have taken, and their build environments, as well as their source code, will have to be kept available indefinitely. The software houses will yell bloody murder, and everyone they can hire, every pundit and lobbyist they can afford, will spew the dire predictions that this law will mean the end of computing as we know it, to which our considered answer is, yes, please, that was exactly the idea. Clause 4, strike back. I suspect that a fair number of you have, in fact, struck back at some attacker somewhere, or at least done the targeting research, even if you didn't pull the trigger. I'd trust many of you to identify targets carefully enough to minimize collateral damage, but what we are talking about here is a cyber equivalent of the smart bomb. As I implied earlier, cyber smart bombs are what the national laboratories of several countries are furiously working on. In that sense, you do know what is happening behind the curtain, and you know how hard targeting really is because you know how hard attribution really is. The issue is shared infrastructure, and that issue is not going away. There are some entities that can operate globally and strike back effectively. Microsoft and FBI teaming up on the game over Zeus Trojan, for example, but that's an expensive therapy in limited supply and can only be applied to the most damaging malware. Nevertheless, that is the therapy that we have. Smaller entities cannot act globally, nor can they act in certain ways without pairing with national agencies. That can and must go on, but I don't see how the individual or the smaller entity can shoot back. All I see is for them to put all their effort into having fast recovery. Number 5, fallbacks and resiliency. There's been a lot of talk about what to do when failure is unacceptable, yet failure is inevitable. Heretofore, almost anything that has come to be seen as essential to the public gets some sort of performance standard imposed upon it, electricity and water, for example. But let's talk about software. For one example, a commonly voiced desire for cryptographic protocols is algorithm agility, the ability to swap from one cryptographic algorithm to another if and when the first becomes unsafe. The security benefit of such a swap is not what you turn on, but what you can turn off. For that to be possible, a second algorithm has to be already in place, but that means that the second algorithm had to be designed in at the outset and at both ends with a way to choose between them such that either end of the proposed connection can force a changeover to the alternate algorithm. One might argue that algorithm agility means a single, more complex algorithm. Or maybe what you want is two algorithms where you always use them both, such as when you encrypt with one and super encrypt with another so that the failure of either has no practical effect. I say all that just to demonstrate that this is not always simple, that having a pre-deployed fallback is not easy, that design willpower alone is not enough. So perhaps mandating pre-deployed fallbacks is a bad idea entirely. Perhaps what is needed is a way to reach out and upgrade the endpoints when the time of necessity comes. But today, or real soon now, most of the places needing a remote management interface through which you can remotely upgrade their endpoints are embedded hardware. So let me ask you a question. Should or should not an embedded system be required to have a remote management interface? If it does not, then a late discovered flaw cannot be fixed without visiting all of them, which is likely to be infeasible because some you will be unable to find, some will be where you cannot again go, and there will be too many of them in any case. If it does have a remote management interface, the opponent of skill will focus on that, and once a break is achieved, will use those same tools to ensure that you don't know he or she is there. Perhaps what is needed is for embedded systems to be more like humans, and I don't mean artificially intelligent. What I mean is embedded systems, if having no remote management interface and thus out of reach, are a life form. And as the purpose of life is to end, an embedded system without a remote management interface must be so designed as to be certain to die no later than some fixed time. Conversely, an embedded system with a remote management interface must be sufficiently self-protecting that it is capable of refusing a command. Inevitable death and purposive resistance are two aspects of the human condition we need to replicate, not somehow to imagine that to overcome them is to improve the future. Lest some of you think this is all so much picayune and tendentious academic perfectionist posturing, let me inform you of at least one example, which I will not go into in detail, not because of secrecy, but because of time. Home routers. Almost all of them use old versions of Linux, old chips, and it is probable that their manufacturers can no longer build them. It appears clear that several of these have a common flaw that can be exploited. It may be that that is what is powering a banking Trojan now in Brazil. But I'll say to you, if this is the case, then you could build a substantial botnet on the exterior of every network. It would not ever be on the inside. Your firewall would never see it. You would have no way of knowing it was there unless you also look at all the packet captures outside of your router. It never need put a single packet through your firewall. But it is most assuredly a latent weapon, one that can be staged to whatever level of prevalence I desire before I ask it to do more. All I need to do in my exploit is to have a way to signal that device to do three things. Stop processing anything it henceforth receives, start flooding the network with a broadcast signal that causes other peers to do the same, and zero the onboard firmware, thus preventing reboot for all time. Now the only way to recover is to unplug all the devices, throw them in the dumpster, and install new ones. But aren't the new ones likely to have the same vulnerability spectrum and CVE that made this possible in the first place? Of course they do. So this is not a quick trip to the big box store, but rather flushing the entire design space and pipeline inventory of every maker of home routers. There was an event at DEF CON exactly around proving this. Resiliency is an area where no one policy can be sufficient, so I've suggested a trio of baby steps. Embedded systems cannot be immortal if they can't be managed. Embedded systems must have a remote management interface if they are immortal, and swap over is preferable to swap out. 6, vulnerability finding. Vulnerability finding is a job. It has been a job for something like 8 years now, more or less. For a good long while, you could do vulnerability finding as a hobby and get paid in bragging rights. But finding vulnerabilities got to be too hard to do as a hobby in your spare time. You needed to work it like a job and get paid. This was the result of hard work on everybody's part. But as the last 4 of the verities of government says, every solution has side effects. In this case, the side effect is that once vulnerability finding became a job and stopped being a bragging rights hobby, those finding the vulnerabilities stopped sharing. If you're finding vulns for fun and fame, then the minute you find a good one, you'll let everybody know just to prevent someone else from beating you to the punch. If you're doing it for profit, you do not share. That's where the side effect is. Once coin-operated vuln finders came to be the case, they haven't shared, and therefore the percentage of all attacks that appear to be 0 days, the percentage has risen. In a May article in The Atlantic, Bruce Schneier asked the cogent first principles question. Are software vulnerabilities dense or sparse? If they are sparse, then every one you find by meaningfully lowers the number of avenues of attack that are extant. If they are dense, then finding and fixing one is essentially irrelevant to security and a waste of the resources spent finding them. 6, take away 1, is a 15% improvement. 6,000 take away 1 has no value whatsoever. If a couple of Texas brothers could corner the world's silver market, there is no doubt that the US government could openly corner the world vulnerability market. That is, we buy them all and we make them public. Simply announce, show us a competing bid, and we'll give you 10x. Sure, there are some who will say, I hate Americans, I sell only to Ukrainians. But because vulnerability finding is increasingly automation assisted, the seller who won't sell to the Americans knows that his vulns will be rediscovered in due course by someone who will sell to the Americans. Thus, his need to sell his product before it outdates is irresistible. This strategy's usefulness comes from 2 side effects. That by overpaying, we enlarge the talent pool of vulnerability finders, and that by making public every single vuln the USG buys, we devalue them. Put differently, by overpaying, we increase the rate of vuln finding, while by showing everyone what it is we bought, we zero out whatever stockpile of cyber weapons our adversaries have. We do not need intelligence on what weapons our adversaries have if we have something to a complete inventory of the world's vulns and have shared that with all the affected suppliers. But this begs Schneier's question. Are vulnerabilities sparse or dense? If they are sparse or merely numerous, then cornering the market wins in due course. If they are dense, then all we would end up doing is increasing costs, both to software suppliers now obligated to repair all the ones a growing army of vuln researchers find, and to the taxpayers. I believe that vulns are scarce enough for this to work, and therefore I believe that cornering the market is the cheapest win we will ever get. Let me note, however, that my colleagues in static analysis report that they regularly see web applications greater than 2 gigs in size and with 20,000 variables. Such web apps can only have been written by machine, and therefore, if vulns are found in them, and they are, those vulns were written by machine. Machine-powered vuln creation might change my analysis, though I can't yet say in what direction. Number 7, the right to be forgotten. I've spoken elsewhere about how we're all intelligence agents now, collecting on each other on behalf of various overlords. There are so many technologies now that power observation and identification. They may not yet be in your pocket or on your dashboard or embedded in all your smoke detectors, but that is only a matter of time. Your digital exhaust is unique, hence it is identifiable. Pooling everyone's digital exhaust also characterizes how you differ from normal. Privacy used to be proportional to that which is impossible to observe, or that which can be observed but is impossible to identify. No more. What is today observable and identifiable kills both privacy as impossible to observe and privacy as impossible to identify, so what might be an alternative? If you're an optimist or an apparatchik, then your answer will tend toward rules of data administered by a government you trust or control. If you're a pessimist or a hacker-maker, then your answer will tend towards the operational, and your definition of a state of privacy will be mine: the effective capacity to misrepresent yourself. Misrepresentation is using disinformation to frustrate data fusion on the part of whomever it is that is watching you. Some of it can be low-tech, such as misrepresentation by paying your therapist in cash under an assumed name. Misrepresentation means arming yourself not at Walmart, but in other living rooms. Misrepresentation means swapping affinity cards at random with like-minded folks, keeping an inventory of misconfigured web servers to proxy through, putting a motor generator between you and the smart grid, using Tor for no reason at all, hiding in plain sight when there's nowhere else to hide. Misrepresentation means not having one digital identity that you cherish, burnish, and protect, but having as many as you can. Your fused identity is not a question unless you work to make it be. Lest you think that this is a problem statement for the random paranoid, let me tell you that in the big I intelligence trade, crafting good cover is getting harder and harder, and for the exact same reasons. Misrepresentation is getting harder and harder. If I was running field operations, I would not try to fabricate complete digital identities. I'd borrow the identity of someone who had the characteristics that I needed for the case at hand. The Obama administration's issuance of a national strategy for trusted identities in cyberspace is case in point. It calls for the development of interoperable technology standards and policies and identity ecosystem where individuals, organizations, and underlying infrastructure such as routers and services can be authoritatively authenticated. If you can trust a digital identity, that is because it cannot be faked. Why does the government care about this? It cares because it wants to digitally deliver government services, and it wants attribution. Is having a non-fakeable digital identity for government services worth the registration of your remaining secrets with that government? Is there any real difference between a system that permits easy, secure, identity-based services and a surveillance system? Do you trust those who hold surveillance data on you over the long haul, by which I mean the indefinite retention of transactional data between government services and you, the individual required to proffer non-fakeable identities to engage in those transactions? Assuming this spreads well beyond the public sector, which is exactly its designer's intent, do you want this everywhere? If you are building authentication systems today, then you're playing ball in this league. If you are using authentication systems today, then you are subject to the pending design decisions of people who are themselves playing ball in this league. After a good amount of waffling, I conclude that a unitary, unfakeable digital identity is no bargain, and I don't want one. I want to choose whether to misrepresent myself. I may rarely use that, but it is my right to do so. If that right vanishes into the panopticon, I have lost something and, in my view, gained next to nothing. In that regard, and acknowledging that this is a baby step, I conclude that the EU's right to be forgotten is both appropriate and advantageous, though it does not go far enough. Being forgotten is consistent with moving to a new town to start over, to changing your name, to a definition of privacy that turns on whether you do or do not retain the effective capacity to misrepresent yourself. A right which I will remind you is routinely granted, but to those who've especially helped governmental causes, witness protection being an example. A right to be forgotten is the only check on the tidal wave of observability that is a ubiquitous fact in our sensor fabric, observability that changes the very quality of, quote, in public. Entities that block deep linking to their web resources are neutralizing indexability. Governments of all stripes irretrievably balkanizing the internet through the self-same vehicle of indexing controls are claiming that a right to do so is inherently theirs. The only democratizing brake on this runaway train is for individuals to be able in their own small way to do the same as do other entities. I find it notably ironic that the Guardian newspaper, in championing Edward Snowden's revelations about privacy loss, is paired with their own editorialization that, quote, no one has a right to be forgotten. Au contraire, Madame et Monsieur, they most assuredly do. Number 8, internet voting. Motivated and expert opponents are very nearly undefendable against. People like you here know this, which is why it is natural for people like us to oppose voting over the internet. The National Center for Policy Analysis thinks it's a bad idea. NIST thinks it's a bad idea. Pamela Smith and Bruce McConnell editorialized in the pages of the Wall Street Journal that it's a bad idea. The fact that we have near universal disdain for the idea amongst those who know something has not seemed to change much policy. Now, it is always true that a thorough security analysis will get much less attention than a juicy conspiracy theory, even if both lead to the same conclusion. How do we explain this? If I knew that, then I would commence to explaining, but we may not need to explain if the integrity of some election is put at question by events. I'd like to think that we don't need carnage to motivate a rethink, but perhaps we do. If we do need carnage, I certainly hope it comes sooner rather than later. Number 9, abandonment. If I abandon a car on the street, then eventually someone will be able to claim title. If I abandon a bank account, then the state will eventually seize it. If I abandon real estate by failing to remedy a trespass, then the fullness of time adverse possession will take over. If I don't use my trademark, then my rights go over to those who use what could have been and could have remained mine. If I abandon my spouse or my children, then everyone is taxed to remedy my actions. If I abandon a patent application, then after a date certain, the teaching that it proposes passes over to the commonweal. If I abandon my hold on the confidentiality data, such as by publishing it, then that data passes over to everyone not to return. If I abandon my storage locker, it will not only be lost to me, but end up on reality TV. Apple computers running 10.5 or less get no updates, and that is a significant fraction of their install base. Microsoft computers running XP get no updates, and that is a significant fraction of their install base. The end of security updates follows abandonment. It is certainly ironic that freshly pirated copies of Windows get security updates while older versions bought legitimately do not. Stating what to me is an obvious policy stance, if Company X abandons a codebase, then that codebase must be open sourced. Irrespective of security issues, many is the time that something I needed has gone missing because its maker killed it. But with respect to security, some constellation of I, we, you, they are willing and able to provide patches or workarounds as time and evil require. Would the public interest not be served by a conversion to open source for abandoned code bases? I believe it would. But wait, you say, isn't purchased software on a general-purpose computer a thing of the past? Isn't the future all about auto-updated smartphone clients transacting over armored private networks to auto-updated cloud services? Maybe, and maybe not. If the two major desktop suppliers update only half of today's desktops, what will the percentage look like tomorrow? If you say, make them try harder, then the legalistic regulatory position is your position, and the ACLU is already in court trying that route. If smartphone auto-update becomes a condition of merchantability, and your smartphone holds the keying material and undeniably says that its user is you, then how long before a FISA court orders a special update to your phone for evidence gathering? If you say, but we already know what they're going to do, don't we? Then the question is what to do about abandoned code bases. Open sourcing abandoned code bases is the worst option except for all the others. But if seizing an abandoned code base is too big a stretch for you before breakfast, let me echo Brian. When a public key infrastructure certifying authority goes bankrupt, who gets the keys? 10, convergence. Let me ask you a question. Are the physical and digital worlds one world or two? Are cyberspace and meat space converging or diverging over time? I conclude that they are converging. But if they are converging, then is cyberspace looking more and more like meat space, or is meat space looking more and more like cyberspace? That is not so clear. Possibility number 1 is that cyberspace becomes more and more like meat space, ergo the recreation of borders and jurisdictional boundaries is what happens next. Possibility number 2 is that meat space becomes more and more like cyberspace, ergo jurisdictional boundaries grow increasingly irrelevant and something akin to one world technocratic government is what follows. The former is heterogeneous, the latter is the monoculture of a single nation state. As we all know, resilience and freedom come from heterogeneity, so converging meat space to cyberspace is the unfavorable outcome. At the end of last year, the Pew Research Center invited 12,000 experts to answer a question. By 2025, will there be significant changes for the worse or hindrances to the way in which people get and share content online compared with the way they operate today? Of those who answered, putting aside whatever selection bias might be in the choice of who bothered to answer and who didn't, Pew found 4 themes dominated their comments. 1, actions by nation states to maintain security and political control will lead to more blocking. 2, trust will evaporate in the wake of revelations about government and corporate surveillance, and likely greater surveillance in the future. 3, commercial pressures affecting everything from internet architecture to the flow of information will endanger the open structure of online life. And 4, efforts to fix the too much information problem will likely overcompensate and thwart content sharing. My colleague Rob Lemos mapped Pew's themes to 2 alternative futures and said this: if cyberspace converges to our physical reality, then we will have balkanization and commercial efforts to create information monopolies. While if the physical world moves toward digital space, then we have greater surveillance, the erosion of trust, information leaking, and the reaction thereto. More crucially, Lemos also observed that the growth of technology has greatly increased personal power. I'm now reading a quotation. The impact that a single person can have on society has significantly increased over time to where a single individual can have devastating effect. The natural reaction for government is to become more invasive, that's possibility 2, or to better defend its monoculture, that's possibility 1, to firewall threats from one and another. Because threats and kinetic impacts can increasingly travel through the digital realm, they necessitate that the policy and legal frameworks of the digital and physical world converge. So he concluded there was nothing you could be done about it. I don't argue with his idea that increasingly powerful location-independent technology in the hands of the many will tend to force changes in the distribution of power. In fact, that is the central theme of this essay, that the power that is growing in the net per se will soon surpass the ability of our existing institutions to modify it in any meaningful way. So either the net must be broken up into governable chunks, or the net becomes government. It seems to me that the leverage here favors cyberspace whenever and wherever we give cyberspace a monopoly position, which we are doing blindly and often. In the last couple of years, I've found that institutions that I more or less must use, my 401k custodian, the Government Accounting Office, Accounts Payable Department, the payroll service my employer outsources to, etc., no longer accept paper letter instructions. They each only accept digital delivery of such instructions. This means that each of them has created a critical dependence on an internet swarming with men in the middle, and which is more, they have doubtlessly given up their own ability to fall back to what worked for a century before. It is that giving up of alternative means that really defines what convergence is and does. It is said that all civil wars are about on whose terms reunification will occur. I would argue that we are, to coin a phrase, in a cold civil war to determine on whose terms that convergence does occur. Everything in meat space we give over to cyberspace replaces dependencies that are local and manageable with dependencies that are certainly not local and I would argue less manageable because they are much less secure. I say that because the root cause of risk is dependence, and most especially dependence on expectations of system state. I say much less secure because one is secure, that is to say, one is in a state of security if and only if there are no unmitigatable surprises. The more we put on the internet, the broader and unmitigatable those surprises become. Let me quote from a Bloomberg article last quarter. Quote, Wall Street's biggest trade group has proposed a government industry cyber war council to stave off terrorist attacks that could trigger financial panic by temporarily wiping out account balances. The proposal by the Security Industry and Financial Markets Association calls for a committee of executives and representatives from at least 8 U.S. agencies, including Treasury, NSA, and Homeland, all led by senior White House officials. The document sketches an unusually frank and pessimistic view by the industry of its readiness for attacks wielded by nation states or terrorist groups that aim to destroy data and machines. It says that concerns are compounded by the dependence on financial institutions on other things such as the electric grid. That's the end of the quotation. So here you have the biggest financial firms saying that their dependencies are no longer manageable and that the state's monopoly on the use of force must be brought to bear. What they are talking about is that we have no way to mitigate the risk of common mode failure. To repeat, risk is a consequence of dependence. Because of shared dependence, aggregate social dependence on the internet is not estimable. If dependencies are not estimable, they will be underestimated. If they are underestimated, they will not be made secure over the long run, only over the short. As the risks become increasingly unlikely to appear, the interval between events grows longer. As the latency between events grows, the assumption that safety has been achieved will also grow, thus fueling increased dependence in what is now a positive feedback loop. Accommodating old methods and internet rejectionists preserves alternate, less complex, more durable means and therefore bounds dependence. Bounding dependence is the core of rational risk management. In sum, as a matter of policy, everything that is officially categorized as a critical infrastructure must conclusively show how it would operate in the absence of the internet. I have a piece coming out shortly where I propose exactly the stress test idea now applied to banks and financial institutions, but to the internet at large. The 2008 financial crisis proved that we can build systems more complex than we can then operate. The best policy counter to that has been that system of stress tests. We need other kinds of stress tests, even more. This is the conclusion. I titled this talk, Shared Risk and What to Do About It, but it is really my version of Realpolitik, which means, in the words of British historian E.H. Carr, that what is successful is right and what is unsuccessful is wrong, and there is no moral dimension in how the world is, and that attempting to govern based on principles cannot succeed. Realpolitik is at once atheist and anti-utopian. To be honest, I find that immensely distasteful, and it seems that in governing my own life, I daily give up power advantage for principle. At the same time, having principles such as might does not make right may well be a blindness on my part, and by extension, a blindness on the part of those who govern according to principles. Cybersecurity, as we describe it in our mailing lists, on our blogs, at our cons, and so forth, is rich in principles and utopian desiderata. All the while, we have opponents at all levels, and probably always will, for whom principle matters little, but power matters a lot. As Thomas Ray said, every successful system accumulates parasites, and the internet plus every widely popular application on it has them. For some observers, parasites and worse are just a cost of doing business. For other observers, design which encourages bad outcomes is an affront which must be fixed. It is realism and realism alone that remains when all else fails. Political realism of the sort I am talking about is based on 4 premises. 1, the international system is anarchic. 2, states are the actors who matter. 3, all states within the system are themselves unitary and rational. 4, the primary concern of all states is survival. This is likewise the realism of the cybersecurity situation in a global internet. It is anarchic. States have become the most important actors. Their investment in offensive cyber is entirely about survival in such a world, and they are driven to this by the dual simultaneous expansion of what is possible and what their citizens choose to depend upon. The late Peter Bernstein, perhaps the world's foremost thinker on the topic, defined risk as more things can happen than will. With technological advance accelerating, more things can happen than will takes on a particularly ominous quality if your job is to ensure citizen survival in an anarchy where daily ever more things can happen than will. Realpolitik would say that under such circumstances, defense is irrelevant. What is relevant is either offense or getting out of the line of fire altogether. States that are investing in offense are being entirely rational and are likely to survive. Those of us who are backing out our remaining dependencies on digital goods and services are being entirely rational and are likely to survive. The masses who quickly depend on every new thing are risk-seeking, even if they do not know it. The states which own them do know it, though, which explains why every state now does to its own citizens what states once only did to officials in competing regimes. You've politely listened to a series of get-off-the-dime policy proposals around mandatory reporting, net neutrality, source code liability, strikeback, resiliency, fallbacks, vulnerability finding, the right to be forgotten, internet voting, abandonment, and convergence, all by one guy that no one ever elected to anything. I thank you, friends and countrymen, for lending me your ears, but I shall be happier still if some one of you or several of you find the articulateness that overcomes the dynamic which we now inhabit, namely that if what is successful is right and what is unsuccessful is wrong, the observable allocation of successes and failures is itself wrong, and it is utterly disconnected from the technical facts as we know them. In the end, reality always wins, and the reality of technical facts has more staying power than the reality of market share or utopian enthusiasm. Nevertheless, cybersecurity is entirely about power and only power. Realpolitik says that what cybersecurity works is right and what cybersecurity does not work is wrong, and Realpolitik thus resonates with how our security will always be exactly as bad as it can be and still allow everything to function. Realpolitik says that offense routinely beats defense and that is right, and imagining otherwise is wrong, that those whose offense wins are right, while those whose defense loses are wrong. Realpolitik says that offense's superiority means that it is a utopian fantasy to believe that information can be protected from leakage, and so the counter-offense of disinformation is what we must employ in return. Realpolitik says that sentient opponents have always been a fact of life, but never before have they been location independent, and never before have they been able to recruit mercenaries who will work for free. Realpolitik says that attribution is impossible unless we deploy a unitary surveillance state. I have long preferred to hire security people who are, more than anything else, sadder but wiser. They, and only they, know that most of what commercially succeeds only so long as attackers do not give it their full attention. And what commercially fails not because it didn't work, but because it wasn't cheap and sexy. Their glasses are not rose-colored. They are spattered with the blood of Realpolitik. Sadder but wiser hires, however, come only from people who have experienced private tragedies, not global ones. There are no people sadder and wiser about the scale and scope of the attack surface you get when you connect everything to everything and give up your prior ability to do without. Until such people are available, I will busy myself with reducing my dependence on, and thus my risk exposure to, the digital world, even though that will be mistaken for being a curmudgeon. Call that misrepresentation if you like. There's never enough time. Thank you for yours.